In 2001, a deputy sheriff was given the easiest job on the schedule: drive a low-level prisoner from one county jail to another. It should have been routine, boring even, but halfway through the trip both men vanished. Hours later, deputies found the patrol car on the side of the road. The engine was still running. The doors were unlocked. The deputy's radio keys, even his weapon, still inside. But the deputy and the prisoner were gone. No blood, no struggle, no witnesses, just gone. For years the case haunted the town. Was it an ambush? Did the prisoner kill the deputy and escape? Or did the deputy help him vanish? Detectives chased hundreds of tips. Families begged for answers. But every single lead went cold. Then, 7 years later, everything changed. In 2008, construction crews were renovating an old roadside motel, only 40 miles from where the patrol car was found. One worker swung a sledgehammer into a crumbling bathroom wall. The plaster cracked, dust filled the air, and inside the hollow space he saw bones. Not one skeleton, two. The motel wall had been hiding the truth for 7 years. And when investigators pulled those remains out, the story that finally emerged was darker, stranger, and far more tragic than anyone had imagined. This is the story of how one easy transport job turned into a nightmare, a mystery that destroyed families, shattered trust in law enforcement, and left behind a chilling reminder that even routine duty can be deadly. Stick around, because once you hear what really happened inside that motel, you'll never look at an empty highway the same way again. And before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you love true crime stories like this, and let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from right now? It was early morning at the county sheriff's office in 2001. Deputies shuffled in and out, grabbing coffee, flipping through paperwork. The air was routine, nothing unusual. Deputy James Carter walked in. He had been with the department for a few years. Hardworking, steady, respected. That morning his name came up for a prisoner transport. The assignment sounded simple: drive a prisoner from the local jail to a holding facility in the next county, about an hour away. No risk, no drama. In fact, when the sergeant read the assignment out loud, some of the other officers joked about it. "Lucky break, Carter, that's easy duty. Don't fall asleep out there." Carter smiled. He wasn't one to complain. A quiet drive on the open road sounded fine to him. He went through the standard prep. He signed the paperwork. He checked the radio. He made sure his squad car had fuel. Then he clipped on his badge, adjusted his vest, and headed toward the jail block. Nothing about the morning suggested danger. Nothing suggested this would be his last assignment. The jail doors buzzed open and Carter stepped inside. The prisoner was already waiting, shackled, hands in front, sitting on a bench. The transport was about to begin. The prisoner's name was Daniel Vega. He was in his 30s, average build, average height. Nothing about him stood out. His record was spotty: petty crimes, a few drug charges, a burglary, but nothing violent, nothing that would raise alarms. When Carter walked in, Vega barely looked up. He kept his eyes low, his body slouched, calm, almost bored. "On your feet," Carter said. Vega stood, slow but without resistance. His chains rattled as the jailer double-checked the cuffs and shackles. Everything was secure. "Let's move," Carter told him. They walked down the hall together. Other inmates shouted from their cells, banging on bars, making noise. But Vega didn't react. He just kept walking, eyes forward. At the exit, Carter guided him to the squad car. Standard procedure: prisoner in the back, separated by plexiglass, doors locked from the outside. Vega sat down quietly. He didn't argue, he didn't talk back. Carter radioed dispatch. "Transport starting, ETA 1 hour. The radio crackled back. "Copy that." Everything seemed normal. Just another day, just another routine trip down the highway. Carter pulled onto the road, not knowing this ride would never reach its destination. The sun was still low as Carter's squad car rolled onto the highway. Traffic was light. The fields on either side stretched for miles. Carter checked his mirrors, his speed, and then his radio. "All good," he said into the mic, making his scheduled check-in. From the backseat, Vega finally spoke. His voice was quiet. "Deputy, you ever get tired of this job?" Carter glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "It's a job, pays the bills." Vega gave a half smile, then leaned back against the seat. The drive was mostly silent after that. Just the hum of the engine, the crackle of the radio, and the sound of tires rolling over asphalt. Carter passed a gas station, then a long stretch of empty farmland. No one around, just open road. He reached for his coffee, took a sip, then glanced at the clock. Another half hour to go. Dispatch expected another check-in soon. Carter always followed the rules. He always called in on time. But on this day, that check-in would never come. The squad car rolled further down the highway. And then, silence. When dispatch radioed back, there was no answer. Dispatch gave Deputy Mark Evans a few minutes of grace. Sometimes officers missed their call because they were focused on the road. But when 5 minutes passed, the radio room grew tense. "Unit 23, status check," the dispatcher repeated. No answer. They tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. It wasn't like Mark to ignore a check-in. He was the kind of deputy who followed the rules by the book. When 10 minutes passed, dispatch flagged it. A supervisor was alerted. "Send a unit to sweep the route," the supervisor ordered. Another deputy picked up the call. He knew Mark well. At first, he thought maybe Mark's radio had gone dead or he pulled over with a flat tire. But the silence on the air was different, longer, heavier. Inside the communications room, radios crackled with updates from other officers. Cars were diverted to the highway, instructed to look for the transport vehicle. The dispatcher kept trying. "Unit 23, do you copy?" Nothing. By the 20-minute mark, unease turned into real fear. This was no simple delay. Something was wrong. For the first time that morning, the words "possible officer down" crossed someone's mind. And with that thought, the search began. Patrol cars rolled out onto the highway, lights flashing. Officers scanned every shoulder, ditch, and rest stop. Helicopters were requested but would take time to arrive. One unit drove the exact route Mark had been assigned. Mile after mile, nothing. No stopped car. No sign of struggle, just empty road. "Still no contact," the radio confirmed. The silence only made everyone more nervous. Some deputies told themselves it was probably a dead radio. Others said maybe Mark had stopped for mechanical trouble. But deep down, they all felt it. This wasn't normal. They pulled into gas stations, diners, and truck stops, asking if anyone had seen the transport car. Nobody had. To the public, it was just another morning on the highway. To law enforcement, it was becoming a nightmare. Then just after noon, one deputy spotted something ahead on the roadside. A vehicle, a patrol car. The call went out. "We've got Unit 23's car." But there was no relief in the voice that said it, because from a distance, the scene already looked wrong. 2 patrol cars pulled up behind Unit 23. The transport vehicle sat on the shoulder of the highway, tilted slightly in the gravel. The engine was still running. Exhaust drifted faintly from the tailpipe. Both front doors hung wide open, as if someone had stepped out in a hurry. The deputies approached carefully, weapons drawn. "Mark, you in there?" one called out, no answer. They checked the front seat. Mark's radio was sitting on the dash. His sidearm was holstered, untouched. The keys were still in the ignition. Nothing was broken. No glass, no blood, no bullet holes. The car looked normal, too normal. One deputy opened the back door. The prisoner's shackles lay on the seat, empty. It didn't make sense. They stepped back, scanning the area. The ditch was clear. The tree line nearby showed no footprints, no drag marks, nothing. The silence was heavy. The only sound was the idling engine, running as if Mark might step back into the car at any second. But he didn't. One of the officers finally said what everyone else was thinking. "They're gone." Within an hour, the scene was swarming with deputies, investigators, and crime scene techs. They taped off the car, took photos, dusted for prints. But the evidence told them nothing. No signs of a fight, no damage to the car, no clue if Mark and the prisoner had left willingly or by force. It was as if the 2 men had been plucked off the road by thin air. Detectives canvassed the area. They questioned drivers who had passed by earlier in the day. No one had seen a thing, not a struggle, not even the car pulled over. By nightfall, the search widened. Helicopters flew overhead. K-9 units sniffed the ground along the highway. The trail stopped cold. For the sheriff's department, this was no longer a delay or a broken radio. This was a deputy gone missing in the middle of a transport. And it was only the beginning of a nightmare case that would haunt the county for years. The call went out fast: deputy missing, prisoner missing, squad car found empty. Within hours, the quiet highway looked like a military zone. Red and blue lights flashed across the dark fields. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights cutting through the night. Deputies spread out in every direction, moving into the woods and ditches with flashlights. Some searched the brush, others followed the fence lines along the road. Every officer knew the stakes. One of their own had vanished. A prisoner, too. Nobody knew if Mark was alive, if he was hurt, or if he had been taken hostage. The sheriff barked orders at the command post. Maps were laid out on the hood of a patrol car. Grid search, half-mile radius. Nobody rests until we find them. Teams pushed deeper into the woods, calling Mark's name. The only reply was the thump of helicopter blades above. At nearby houses, detectives knocked on doors asking if anyone had seen or heard something. Most shook their heads. No gunshots, no screaming, just silence. By dawn, the search grew larger. State troopers arrived. Federal agents were called. The case was no longer local. A deputy and a prisoner had simply disappeared, and no one could explain how. Just after sunrise, handlers brought in K-9 teams. The dogs were trained for one job: track human scent. One dog sniffed Mark's uniform jacket taken from the car. Another sniffed the prisoner's shackles. Almost immediately, the dogs pulled hard, eager to chase. They followed the shoulder of the highway for nearly a quarter-mile. Deputies jogged behind, hearts racing, hoping this was the break they needed. But then suddenly the dogs stopped. They circled, noses to the ground, confused. Handlers encouraged them, but the trail was gone, like it had been cut off. The search leaders marked the spot. It didn't make sense. How could two men, one shackled, just vanish into thin air? Investigators began to wonder if a car had picked them up. Maybe the prisoner had friends waiting, or maybe someone else had forced both men off the road. The dogs were tried again and again. Each time the same result. The scent went dead at that same stretch of pavement. For the deputies, this was worse than finding nothing. It meant the men had left the area fast. And with every passing hour, the chances of finding them alive grew smaller. By mid-morning, detectives gathered at the command post. The first theory was obvious. The prisoner had somehow overpowered the deputy. But right away, problems appeared. The prisoner had been shackled hand and foot. Escaping restraints inside a moving car wasn't easy, and Mark was trained, alert, and armed. How could a single prisoner pull that off without leaving signs of a fight? Still, detectives kept the idea alive. Maybe the deputy had stopped for some reason: bathroom, food, or a quick check. That could have given the prisoner a chance. But again, no witnesses had seen the deputy or prisoner outside the car. Not at gas stations, not at diners, nowhere. If it had been an escape, it was unlike any they had ever seen, and that made detectives uneasy. The squad car was towed to a secure lot, and forensic teams got to work. They went over every inch, starting with the driver's seat. No blood, no broken glass, nothing suggesting a fight. The steering wheel was clean, the radio undamaged, the dashboard normal. The backseat was checked next, the place where the prisoner had been shackled. Forensics expected to find torn restraints, broken cuffs, or at least a sign of struggle. Instead, they found nothing. The cuffs were missing, but there was no evidence of them being forced open. Fingerprints were tested. The results showed only the deputies and the prisoners. No unknown prints, no hint of a third person. For detectives, this was maddening. The car gave them nothing to work with. It was as if the deputy and prisoner had stepped out quietly and just walked away. But both men had families. Both had reasons to live. So where were they? Detectives knew the highway was not empty. Trucks, commuters, and locals used it every day. Someone had to have seen something. Officers canvassed the area, going door to door at nearby houses, farms, and gas stations. They asked the same question: did you see a squad car stopped? Did you see the deputy or the prisoner? The answers were frustrating. Everyone remembered seeing flashing lights later in the night, once the search began. But during the critical hours when Mark and the prisoner vanished, nothing. Truckers passing through were asked. Some recalled a police car parked on the shoulder, but that was normal. None saw anyone standing outside it. Gas station workers were pressed for details. No one had seen Mark come in. No prisoner either. It was as if the squad car had been invisible. The lack of witnesses stunned investigators. This wasn't a rural back road. It was a state highway. But somehow, in that busy stretch, both men had vanished without leaving a single pair of eyes to tell the story. The silence of the public added another layer to the mystery. News of the disappearance spread fast. By morning, both families were living a nightmare. Mark's wife stood in front of news cameras, clutching a photo of her husband. She begged for answers. He wouldn't just leave. Please, if anyone knows something, speak up. Their children stayed inside, too young to understand why their father hadn't come home. At the prisoner's family home, reporters gathered too. His relatives insisted he wasn't on the run. His sister said through tears, "He would have called us. He always calls, even from jail." They believed something had happened to him as well. Detectives interviewed both families carefully, searching for clues. Did the prisoner have enemies? Did Mark have problems at work or at home? Nothing concrete surfaced. For the families, every passing hour was torture. They clung to hope but feared the worst. 2 men were gone, 2 families were broken, and no one had answers. By the end of the first week, facts were scarce, but rumors spread fast. At coffee shops and truck stops, locals whispered about what really happened that night. Some believed the deputy had been ambushed. Maybe the prisoner's friends were waiting, one man said. They could have forced him off the road. That idea scared people. If true, it meant dangerous men had carried out a bold, silent attack on an armed deputy. Others pushed a darker theory that the deputy himself was corrupt. "Think about it," a neighbor muttered. "He had the prisoner in chains. What if he let him go? What if they left together?" The thought of a trusted officer helping a criminal shocked the community, but the lack of evidence made anything seem possible. Another rumor was even stranger, that the prisoner wasn't the real target at all. Maybe the deputy had been taken because of something else, something hidden. Investigators had no proof for any of these claims, but the damage was done. The case had moved beyond facts. It was now a story everyone told in their own way. For the deputy's family, the gossip was cruel. They couldn't believe he would betray his badge. For the prisoner's relatives, the whispers about escape were just as painful. Both families were left defending their loved ones against shadows and speculation. And with no real leads, rumors filled the space where answers should have been. Weeks turned into months and the case stood still. Detectives worked the phones, chased down every lead, and interviewed anyone who might know something. But each trail ended the same way, dead. The abandoned squad car remained the only solid clue. No fingerprints, no struggle, no blood. It was like the deputy and prisoner had stepped into thin air. The sheriff's office faced growing pressure. At town meetings, citizens demanded answers. "How can a deputy just disappear?" one man shouted. "If he's not safe, none of us are." Reporters crowded the station every day, pressing detectives for updates. But there were none. Behind closed doors, investigators argued. Some thought it was an escape gone wrong. Others feared it was a planned hit, maybe tied to the prisoner's criminal past. Without evidence, nobody could prove anything. For the deputy's family, the silence was unbearable. His wife kept a porch light on every night, hoping he would walk through the door. The prisoner's relatives begged the media not to paint him as a monster, insisting he was a victim too. But with no progress, faith in law enforcement began to weaken. The case was slipping from control. With no answers, locals began filling the void with theories. The most damaging one spread quickly. Maybe the deputy had run away. It sounded outrageous at first, but whispers turned into questions. Did the deputy want a different life? Was he secretly friends with the prisoner? Did he unlock the cuffs, get in another car, and vanish on purpose? Detectives took the theory seriously enough to investigate. They dug into the deputy's bank accounts. No strange deposits, no sudden withdrawals. They checked his phone records. No secret calls, no hidden contacts. They even looked into his marriage. Friends described him as a family man who loved his wife and kids. No signs he wanted to abandon them. Still, rumors spread. At diners and gas stations, people leaned across tables and said, "You never really know someone." For the deputy's family, it was cruel. His wife called the idea nonsense. His children asked why people thought their dad left them. Detectives could find no proof. But the longer the case stayed cold, the harder it was to silence the rumor. And with every whisper, trust in the deputy's name began to fade. As the months dragged on, the rumors turned darker. This time, the spotlight shifted from the prisoner to the sheriff's office itself. Locals began whispering about corruption. What if the deputy found out something he shouldn't have? People asked. What if other cops wanted him gone? The idea gained traction fast. Some said drug money flowed through the county. Others believed certain officers had ties to gangs. In that version of the story, the prisoner wasn't the main target, the deputy was. Detectives working the case denied it. They said there was no proof of dirty cops, no evidence of a cover-up. But the public didn't let it go. The sheriff's office had already failed to protect one of its own. People wondered, what else were they hiding? For the deputy's family, the theory cut deep. They wanted answers, but not like this. Suggesting other officers killed him felt like a betrayal of everything he stood for. Still, the rumor refused to die. And in a small town, whispers travel fast. Investigators knew they had to be thorough. If the deputy had secrets, they needed to find them. They started with his bank records. Every deposit and withdrawal was checked. There were no unexplained amounts, no sudden spikes of cash. His paychecks were normal. His bills were consistent. Next, they examined his phone logs. Detectives searched for unknown numbers or late-night calls. Nothing unusual appeared. His calls were routine, family, coworkers, a few close friends. Then came his marriage. Detectives spoke with his wife, neighbors, and friends. Everyone described him as loyal, steady, and deeply committed to his kids. No affairs, no strange behavior. They checked his locker at work, his car, even his computer at home. Again, nothing. It was the same story everywhere. The deputy lived a simple, straightforward life. No hidden bank accounts, no double life, no dark secrets. If he had vanished willingly, investigators couldn't find a single reason why. As the case dragged on, tips flooded the sheriff's office. A trucker swore he saw the prisoner at a gas station 2 towns over. Detectives rushed there, checked security footage, and found nothing. A woman claimed she spotted him in Oklahoma, walking along a road. Deputies in that county searched but came up empty. Another caller insisted the prisoner had crossed into Mexico. Federal agents were notified and border checkpoints were checked. Again, nothing. Each tip gave families hope for a moment, but every lead ended the same, dead. The FBI tracked reports from across the country, even into Canada. Some callers said the prisoner was working construction. Others claimed he was hiding with relatives. None of it ever checked out. After months of false alarms, detectives grew weary. They couldn't ignore tips, but chasing them drained time and resources. The truth was simple. No one had seen the deputy and no one had seen the prisoner. They were gone. And the longer it stayed that way, the more impossible the case began to feel. For the deputy's family, the silence was unbearable. Days turned into months and months into years, but they refused to give up hope. At their small home, a single porch light was left on every night. His wife said it was a signal, just in case he found his way back. "The light will guide him home," she told reporters. Inside, his kids kept his belongings close. One child slept with their dad's old jacket. Another left drawings on his desk, waiting for him to return. Holidays were the hardest. The empty chair at the table reminded everyone of what was missing. Friends and neighbors stopped by often, bringing food and prayers. But behind closed doors, the family felt the weight of the rumors. People questioned the deputy's loyalty, his choices, even his character. His family ignored the gossip. To them, he was still the same man, faithful, loving, and brave. And they believed he would come home. By 2003, 2 years after the deputy and prisoner vanished, the case was falling apart. Leads had slowed to nothing. The early rush of tips, sightings, and theories had dried up. Detectives found themselves chasing the same questions with no new answers. One by one, the original investigators were reassigned. Some retired, others transferred to different units. Fresh detectives came in, but with no new evidence, they were stuck rereading old reports. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. At press conferences, the sheriff's office gave the same statement: "We are still investigating." But behind the scenes, the truth was clear. The trail was dead. Families noticed it first. Fewer calls from detectives, less urgency. The updates stopped coming. Hope began to fade. For the deputy's family, each passing day was agony. His wife still left the porch light on, but deep down, she felt time slipping away. His children grew older without answers. The prisoner's relatives also suffered. They insisted he wasn't a fugitive, that he too was a victim. But with no proof, their voices grew quieter. The case hadn't been solved. It hadn't even been closed. It just went cold. Inside the sheriff's office, the case became just another box on a shelf. It was thick, hundreds of pages of reports, maps, and interview notes, photos of the abandoned squad car, records of every false sighting, diagrams of the highway. Everything detectives had collected in those early months was crammed into one battered file. But as new crimes demanded attention, burglaries, drug busts, assaults, the missing deputy's case slipped lower on the priority list. Resources were pulled away. Manpower was cut. Detectives who had once worked late nights on the mystery now spent their days chasing newer, fresher cases. The box stayed in storage, pulled out only when someone happened to ask about it. For the families, it was heartbreaking. They still called the sheriff's office asking for updates. Most times the answer was the same: "We're still looking." But they knew the truth. The case was gathering dust. Occasionally, a new detective would flip through the file, trying to spark life into the mystery. But without fresh evidence, they could do little more than review the same dead ends. In the break room, deputies sometimes mentioned the case in hushed tones. "Remember the one who vanished with a prisoner? Never found them." It became more of a story than an active investigation. 7 years passed this way. No new leads, no fresh breaks, just silence sealed inside a box. Even as the sheriff's office slowed down, the families refused to let the case fade. The deputy's wife became the loudest voice. She called reporters, wrote letters, and begged for updates. Whenever a news station would listen, she told the story again. Her husband was loyal, dedicated, and he would never run away. She wanted the world to know he was still missing, and that he still mattered. Local papers sometimes picked it up, printing anniversary stories. 1 year later, 5 years later, each headline reminded people of the deputy who had vanished with a prisoner. The prisoner's family fought too, but their struggle was harder. People often painted him as the villain, assuming he escaped and maybe killed the deputy. But his mother insisted otherwise. She told anyone who would listen, "My son wouldn't do this. If the deputy is gone, then so is he. They're both victims." Her words were rarely published. Still, she repeated them. She wanted the world to remember that 2 men were missing, not just one. The families never met face to face, but their grief ran parallel. Both households kept photos framed on mantels. Both prayed for answers. Both refused to let the case be forgotten. Time didn't heal. It only deepened the wound. For the deputy's family, each year was marked not by new memories but by empty ones. Birthdays came with one less chair at the table. Holidays felt incomplete. His children grew taller, celebrated milestones, but their father was never there to see it. School events, graduations, even small everyday moments, each one carried a shadow. His wife carried the hardest burden. Friends tried to comfort her, but nothing filled the silence of a missing husband. She lived in limbo, unable to grieve, unable to move on, trapped between hope and despair. The prisoner's family felt the same ache. His mother grew older, weaker, but she kept his room untouched. She baked his favorite pie every birthday, then let it sit, uneaten, on the counter. Neighbors whispered, some cruelly suggesting her son was guilty, but she never stopped believing he was gone against his will. Year after year, the two families endured the same pain, waiting without answers. The town moved on. New cases filled headlines. But for the families, the silence was deafening. Time marched forward, but their loved ones were frozen in the same unsolved moment. As the years stretched on, the families faced a painful divide. Hope versus reality. Some relatives clung to faith that the deputy and prisoner were still alive somewhere. They imagined unlikely scenarios, a secret kidnapping, a hidden survival story, maybe even a daring escape that would one day be explained. They kept pictures framed in bright spots of the house, as if expecting their loved one to walk through the door at any moment. Others, however, began to face a quieter truth. They didn't say it out loud at first, but in private they admitted the odds. After so many years without a single clue, survival felt impossible. Quietly, they started to prepare for the worst. They visited cemeteries, wondering where a headstone might go. They thought about how they would word an obituary. These were thoughts they carried in silence, not wanting to upset those still holding out hope. Family gatherings became tense. One person would speak about miracles, while another would sit in silence, unwilling to argue but unable to agree. The divide wasn't born out of anger, it came from pain. Each person had to cope in their own way. Hope gave strength, reality gave closure, neither was easy. As the case dragged deeper into silence, this divide only grew sharper. The deputy's wife held on to hope longer than most, her porch light still burning every night. The prisoner's mother, though frail, still spoke as if her son would walk in tomorrow. But siblings, cousins, and in-laws quietly braced for the truth they feared. Both men were gone. It became the family's greatest struggle, not just missing their loved ones, but living between hope and reality. By now, the case was more than a mystery. It was a legend. In small diners along the highway, old men leaned over coffee and retold the story. A deputy and his prisoner gone without a trace. Some swore they knew what happened. Others argued back, spinning their own theories. It became a kind of local folklore, with new twists added each time it was told. At bars, the whispers grew darker. Some claimed the deputy was secretly dirty, running off with the prisoner. Others insisted the prisoner had powerful friends who helped him escape. A few said it had to be an ambush, a setup the sheriff's office covered up. Newcomers to town quickly learned the story. Someone would always bring it up. Did you hear about the deputy who vanished with his prisoner? It was like a ghost story, one that haunted every corner of the community. For the families, hearing it treated like gossip was painful. To them, it wasn't a mystery for late-night talk. It was real, raw loss. But to the town, the story had become part of its identity, a riddle that defined the place. Years later, the legend still echoed, keeping the mystery alive long after the trail had gone cold. 7 years. That's how long it had been since the deputy and the prisoner vanished. For the town, life carried on. Kids who were in grade school when it happened were now teenagers. Businesses opened, others closed. Roads were repaved. People moved away, new families moved in. But for those closest to the case, time stood still. Every year, the deputy's family marked another birthday, another holiday, another anniversary with an empty chair at the table. His children grew older without their father there to see it. His wife kept photos of him in every room, refusing to let his memory fade. The prisoner's family lived in a different kind of shadow. They didn't hold memorials or porchlight vigils. Instead, they argued with whispers. Was he guilty? Was he innocent? Was he alive, or was he gone? Their home carried a silence no one wanted to break. The sheriff's department had long moved on to other cases, other crimes, but this one never disappeared completely. The box of files sat on a shelf, dusty and untouched, but always there, like a weight no one wanted to lift. Detectives who once worked the case were promoted, transferred, or retired, leaving behind unanswered questions. 7 years is a long time for silence. By then, most assumed the truth would never be found. Yet the families refused to let go. They still wanted answers, even if the answers brought pain. The mystery lingered, hanging over the community like a cloud. 2 men had vanished in broad daylight, leaving no trace, no witness, no explanation. The years only deepened the wound, making the case feel less like an investigation and more like a ghost story, one that seemed destined never to end. But in 2008, when hope was nearly gone, A crew with sledgehammers would stumble on something that changed everything. It was the summer of 2008 when a small construction crew arrived at a worn-down roadside motel. The building sat just off the highway, 40 miles from where the deputy and the prisoner had vanished years earlier. By then, the motel was a ghost of itself. The paint had peeled away, windows were broken, and weeds pushed up through the parking lot. Most people drove past without even noticing it anymore. The new owner had bought the property cheap. His plan was simple: renovate the rooms, fix the roof, and maybe reopen the place. For the crew, it was just another job. They brought in tools, laid down tarps, and started swinging hammers. At first, it was routine. Old carpet was ripped out, broken furniture was tossed into dumpsters, and years of dust filled the air. The workers joked about how many cockroaches they'd find or whether the building was haunted. Nothing about the job seemed unusual. But this motel had been standing for decades. It had seen strangers come and go, secrets checked in and out, and stories left behind in silence. Beneath its crumbling walls, it held something no one expected. For now, the workers didn't know that. They only knew they had weeks of hard labor ahead. What waited inside those walls would remain hidden, at least for a little longer. Days into the renovation, the crew turned their focus to the bathrooms. The tiles were cracked, the plumbing rusted, and mold spread across the walls. One worker picked up a heavy sledgehammer, ready to smash through the plaster. The first few swings sent chunks of wall crashing to the floor. Dust filled the air, mixing with the smell of damp wood and mildew. Behind the plaster, the workers expected to see pipes, wiring, maybe pests. But instead, they noticed something odd. The wall seemed thicker than it should be, like there was extra space hidden inside. The worker struck again, harder this time. A hollow thud echoed back. Everyone paused. They leaned in close, shining flashlights into the crack that had opened. The gap revealed dark space, a cavity that shouldn't have been there. At first, they assumed it was just poor construction, maybe an old repair job or a hidden storage spot. But as they chipped away more plaster, the opening grew wider. The air inside was stale, colder than the rest of the room. Something was hidden in this motel, and the crew was about to uncover it. The worker raised his sledgehammer again and swung hard at the bathroom wall. The plaster cracked, dust poured down, and then clang. The hammer didn't sink in like before. It bounced back as if it had struck something solid. The sound froze the crew. That wasn't the hollow echo of rotten wood or weak drywall. It was sharp, metallic, and completely out of place. The worker hit the same spot again. Clang. Same sound. He set the hammer down and leaned in, pressing his ear against the wall. "There's something back here," he said. The others gathered close, listening to the strange, dull vibration that rang out after each strike. They chipped away more plaster with smaller tools, trying not to damage whatever was hiding inside. Slowly, bits of broken tile and drywall fell away, widening the gap. A glint of something caught the light. Rusted, rough, but definitely metal. "Why would there be metal inside a motel wall?" one of the men asked. The room grew tense. This wasn't a normal renovation find. The crew worked in silence, their laughter and jokes gone. Everyone knew they had stumbled on something that wasn't supposed to be there. Piece by piece, the workers cleared the plaster. The hole opened wider until they could see it clearly, a cavity hidden inside the wall. It wasn't part of the building's design. The cavity had been sealed shut on purpose. The plaster over it was smoother, newer, as if someone had patched it carefully to hide what lay inside. The workers shined a flashlight through the gap. The beam cut into the darkness, showing the edges of a small, cramped, hollow space. It looked big enough for a person to crawl into, if they were desperate enough. But this wasn't storage. The air that drifted out was heavy, stale, and sour. The crew instinctively stepped back. Something about it felt wrong. One of the men muttered, "This ain't right, call the boss." Another whispered, "Call the cops." They had uncovered more than a bad renovation job. Inside that wall was a secret that had been sealed for years, waiting for someone to break it open. A worker knelt down and aimed his flashlight deeper into the dark cavity. At first, the beam only caught dust and broken chunks of wood. Then something pale appeared. At first glance, it looked like stone, But when the light lingered, everyone realized what it really was. Bone. The man stumbled back, his face draining of color. Another worker leaned in to see. The flashlight beam swept across the cavity, revealing more shapes, curved pieces, long and thin, all coated in dust. It wasn't just one bone. It was many. The room went silent. Nobody spoke. As the crew widened the hole further, the picture became horrifyingly clear. Inside the wall were not one, but two skeletons. They were crammed together in the hidden cavity, pressed into the space as if someone had sealed them in. The bones were brittle, stained with age but unmistakable. One skull leaned sideways, jaw hanging open. Another lay partly buried in the plaster dust. Shackles still clung to rusted metal around one set of ankles. The men backed away in shock, some cursed. One ran outside, gagging in the dirt. This wasn't just a renovation anymore. They had stumbled onto a crime scene. The motel owner called 911. Within minutes, the small parking lot filled with flashing red and blue lights. Patrol cars screeched to a stop. Officers jumped out, guns drawn at first, unsure what they were walking into. The construction crew pointed them toward the bathroom. Soon, detectives and crime scene techs crowded the narrow hallway. The smell of dust and rot clung to the air. When officers saw the skeletons, the room went silent again. Everyone knew this was big. Yellow police tape was rolled across the motel doors. The entire property was shut down. Workers were questioned and told to stay put. Curious drivers slowed along the highway, staring at the sudden swarm of activity. Forensic teams arrived with cameras, evidence bags, and gloves. They carefully began pulling pieces from the wall, bone by bone, fragment by fragment. Every move was documented, every discovery photographed. Word spread fast. News crews set up outside the taped perimeter. Neighbors whispered to each other, wondering whose remains had been hidden so carefully and for how long. The mystery that had haunted the town for 7 years was about to break wide open. As night fell, floodlights lit up the crumbling motel. What had started as a routine renovation was now the center of a massive crime scene. The air buzzed with radios, camera shutters, and the low hum of generators. Detectives moved quickly but carefully, aware that every inch of the wall might hold the answers to a mystery that had haunted them for years. Inside the room, forensic teams worked in near silence. Gloves snapped on hands, flashbulbs clicked, and evidence markers appeared one by one. Every bone was documented before being removed. They weren't just pulling skeletons out of a wall, they were recovering the truth. As the cavity was cleared, more details came into focus. A rusted belt buckle, a strip of fabric, rotted and brittle but still clinging to one of the skeletons. A broken pair of handcuffs, the chain fused with rust. Each discovery was bagged and labeled. Detectives exchanged tense looks. This wasn't random. The way the bodies were placed, the care taken to seal them in, it told them this had been deliberate. Someone had worked hard to hide what had happened here. One detective finally spoke the words everyone was already thinking. This could be our deputy. The room went still. For years, the missing deputy and prisoner had been nothing more than names in a cold case file. Now, for the first time, there was physical proof that tied directly back to 2001. By midnight, the remains of both skeletons had been carefully removed. They were loaded into separate vans and driven to the medical examiner's office. Detectives stayed behind, combing the room inch by inch. They pulled up tiles, scraped through plaster dust, even searched the pipes for hidden evidence. Outside, the motel parking lot looked like a spotlighted stage. News vans had gathered, reporters speaking live into cameras, trying to explain what was unfolding. Locals stood behind the barricades, whispering rumors, some of them already guessing what the police were about to confirm. Around 2 a.m., the lead detective stepped outside. His face was pale, his eyes red from hours without rest. He didn't give details, but his words hit everyone like a hammer. "We believe these remains are connected to a case from 2001. That was all he said, but it was enough. The whispers turned into gasps. People knew exactly which case he meant. The search for the deputy and the prisoner wasn't over. It was about to enter its final chapter. At the medical examiner's office, The bones were laid out on clean white tables. Forensic specialists worked carefully, documenting every fracture, every trace of evidence still clinging to the remains. Dental records came first. It didn't take long. Within days, the truth was confirmed. The bones belonged to the missing deputy and the prisoner he had been escorting back in 2001. The news hit both families like a wave. For the deputy's loved ones, there was a mix of relief and heartbreak. The 7 years of not knowing were finally over. But now, the finality of death crashed in. Their husband, father, and son wasn't coming home. For the prisoner's family, the reaction was just as emotional. They had insisted for years that he must be dead, that he never would have stayed silent this long. Now, their worst fears were confirmed. He hadn't escaped. He had been murdered. Police called a press conference. Cameras flashed as the sheriff spoke. His voice shook slightly as he confirmed what everyone suspected. The case of the vanished deputy and prisoner was no longer a disappearance. It was a double homicide. The cold case had come alive again. The forensic team kept digging. They weren't satisfied with just identifying the victims. They wanted answers about how and when the two men had died. Careful study of the bones showed something chilling. The prisoner had been killed first. Evidence pointed to execution, a single, fatal wound. The deputy's remains told a different story. His death had come later, possibly days after the prisoner. This detail changed everything. It meant the deputy hadn't died in the same moment as the prisoner. He might have been held captive, kept alive for reasons investigators could only guess at. Detectives began piecing together the timeline. In 2001, the deputy had gone missing during the transport. Both men were taken to the motel. The prisoner was silenced almost immediately. But the deputy, he was collateral damage, someone the killers hadn't planned for but couldn't risk letting go. The thought was horrifying. For the deputy's family, it meant he might have suffered in those final days. For investigators, it meant the crime had been methodical, planned, and cruel. This wasn't random violence. It was a message. Detectives focused on one question. How did the deputy end up at the motel in the first place? His assigned route never passed that way. He had no reason to stop there. Digging through old call logs and dispatch records, investigators found a gap, a stretch of time unaccounted for during the transport. They believed the deputy had been tricked. Someone may have used a fake emergency, a staged breakdown, or even false orders to lure him off course. The motel itself had stood almost empty back in 2001. Few guests, few eyes watching. It was the perfect place to carry out a crime without anyone noticing. Witnesses from that year recalled shady activity around the property, strangers coming and going at odd hours, cars parked and gone before sunrise. The pieces started to line up. The deputy never walked into a trap blindly. He had been guided there, step by step, until he and the prisoner were in a place where no help could reach them. What happened inside those walls wasn't chance. It was planned. The motel wasn't just a hiding spot. It was the execution site. Investigators broadened their search. If this wasn't random, then who had the power and motive to pull it off? The answer came from old case files. In 2001, the prisoner had been set to testify in a drug case. That case was tied to a local gang with connections across the state. They had a reputation for brutal silencing of witnesses. Anyone who talked ended up dead. Detectives now believed the gang had orchestrated the entire event. The prisoner was never meant to reach the next jail. He was targeted, marked for death before he could speak in court. The deputy, tragically, was caught in the middle. To the killers, he was simply collateral damage, an innocent man who had seen too much. Surveillance records from that era showed gang members in the area around the time of the disappearance. Their vehicles had been spotted near highways close to the motel. It all fit. The double murder wasn't about escape or betrayal. It was about silencing, and the motel wall had been their cover-up. For years, people argued about what really happened that night. Some believed the deputy helped the prisoner escape. Others thought the prisoner killed the deputy and ran. But the bones inside the motel wall told a different story. And when detectives dug deeper into the prisoner's background, the real motive finally came into focus. The prisoner was not just any inmate being transferred. He was a key witness in an upcoming drug case. Prosecutors were preparing to put away a dangerous local gang, and his testimony was critical. He knew names, routes, safe houses, and cash stashes. If he made it to court, several high-ranking members of the gang could be locked away for life. That made him a target. The gang had a long history of silencing people who talked. Informants vanished, witnesses backed out, and rival dealers turned up dead. Fear was their greatest weapon, and this prisoner was about to break the code of silence. Detectives pieced it together. The gang had eyes inside the system. Someone knew about the prisoner's transfer route. Someone leaked that information. And once they had it, they set their trap. The plan didn't need to be complicated. The gang didn't care about the deputy. He was simply in the wrong place, doing his job. Their only goal was to make sure the prisoner never spoke in court. The deputy's murder was just collateral damage. Investigators now believed the deputy was lured off course with false information, maybe a fake call for help, maybe a staged situation. Once he pulled into the motel lot, the trap closed. The killers were waiting. The prisoner was the main target. He was executed first. The deputy likely witnessed it, leaving the gang no choice but to eliminate him as well. Both men disappeared into the motel wall, hidden in silence for years. But the killers had achieved what they wanted. The trial collapsed. Without the prisoner's testimony, the case fell apart. The gang stayed free, their power untouched. In the end, it wasn't about escape, betrayal, or even corruption. It was about silencing one voice, a voice that could have brought down a criminal empire. The prisoner's fate was sealed the moment he agreed to testify. And tragically, the deputy paid the price for being the man ordered to drive him that night. When detectives laid out the timeline, one fact stood out clear. The deputy was never the target. He wasn't involved in the drug case. He wasn't tied to the gang. He didn't even know the prisoner beyond that one assignment. His only mistake was being the man chosen to drive the transport car that night. The gang had no reason to hate him. They didn't even know his name until the moment he showed up. To them, he was just another uniform, someone standing between them and their real goal. In their eyes, he wasn't a person with a family, a wife, and kids. He was an obstacle, and obstacles were removed. Investigators believe that once the gang ambushed the car, they focused first on the prisoner. That man was the key piece, the one who could destroy everything they built. He was silenced quickly, executed before he could say a word. The deputy, though, he saw it happen. He became a liability. For the killers, that decision was simple. If they let him live, he would call for help, identify them, and blow the entire plan. If they killed him, no one could tie them to the crime. Cold logic, but deadly effective. And so, in just minutes, the deputy's life was stolen. Not because of his actions, not because of mistakes, but because he was there. Wrong place, wrong time. Detectives shared this with the family years later. It was almost harder to hear than the idea of betrayal. To know that their husband, father, and son had been murdered for nothing. No grudge, no reason, no chance to fight back. He didn't die a hero chasing down a suspect. He didn't die protecting anyone. He died because ruthless men saw him as an inconvenience. In law enforcement, officers know the job is dangerous. But this was different. It wasn't a shootout. It wasn't a high-speed chase. It was a quiet drive on an ordinary night, and in a single moment it became the end of everything. The gang got what they wanted. The trial collapsed. Their power remained intact, and a good man's life ended as a side effect. The phrase investigators used again and again was chilling. Collateral damage. That's what the deputy was reduced to in the killer's minds. But to his family, to his community, and to the fellow deputies who served beside him, he was so much more. A husband who never came home, a father who missed graduations and weddings, a brother and son whose chair stayed empty at the holidays. The truth was out now. The deputy hadn't run away. He wasn't corrupt. He didn't betray his badge. He was innocent. And he paid the price for simply doing his duty. When detectives finally pieced everything together, the hardest part came next, telling the families. For years, both households had lived in a fog of questions. Now, officers had answers, but those answers would break hearts. The deputy's family was called into the sheriff's office first. His wife, now older and worn from years of waiting, sat between her children. They had grown up without him but still carried his face in their minds. The sheriff didn't speak right away. He looked at the family and took a deep breath. Then slowly, he explained the truth. The deputy had never abandoned them. He hadn't run away. He hadn't chosen corruption or betrayal. He had been ambushed. The prisoner was killed because he was about to testify, and the deputy, he was collateral damage. Tears filled the room. For so long they had held onto the hope that maybe, just maybe, he was alive somewhere. Now that hope was gone, but with the pain came something else, relief. At least they knew. At least the whispers could stop. At least his name was cleared. His wife clutched a folded photograph and whispered, "He was innocent. That's all I ever wanted people to know." Next came the prisoner's family. They had lived under a different cloud, accusations, blame, and shame. People in town assumed he had escaped and maybe even killed the deputy. His siblings had heard cruel comments in grocery store aisles, whispers at school, stares that never stopped. Detectives sat with them and explained. He hadn't escaped. He hadn't killed anyone. He had been executed, targeted because he was ready to testify in court. He never got the chance. His mother cried out, her voice breaking. So he wasn't the monster people said. No, the detective replied. He was a victim. The family wept. The truth didn't erase the pain of his death, but it gave them dignity back. Their son wasn't a fugitive. He hadn't vanished by choice. He, too, had been trapped in something far bigger than himself. News spread quickly through the town. For years, neighbors had argued about what happened. Now the speculation ended. Both families had carried unbearable weight, one accused of betrayal, the other accused of violence. Now, both were recognized as victims of a ruthless crime. At the deputy's house, the porch light that had burned every night for 7 years was finally turned off. His family gathered in silence, knowing he would never walk through the door, but also knowing his honor was restored. At the prisoner's home, relatives placed flowers on a small table by the window, finally able to mourn him openly, without shame. They could grieve not a criminal, but a son stolen too soon. The truth didn't heal everything. It didn't bring either man back, but it closed the door on lies, rumors, and endless waiting. Both families could finally stop asking why and what if. Now they knew. And while the pain remained, at least the dark was gone. The night the bones were identified, the story didn't just shock the families. It shook the entire county. Within hours, the news spread through local TV, newspapers, and radio. A deputy and a prisoner, missing for 7 years, had been found bricked inside a motel wall. People couldn't believe it. A mystery that had haunted the town for so long was suddenly back in the spotlight. Phone lines at the sheriff's office lit up. Reporters demanded statements. Residents called with questions. And the families, already broken from the news, now had cameras on their lawns. The quiet case that had gathered dust for years was alive again. Detectives who had once worked the file were called back in. Boxes of evidence were pulled from the shelves. Photographs, interview notes, radio logs, all of it was spread across tables like it was 2001 again. Younger officers who had only heard whispers of the case now stood shoulder to shoulder with veterans, combing through every detail. The sheriff held a press conference. He stood stiffly at the podium, cameras flashing, microphones lined up in front of him. His voice was firm but strained. He admitted mistakes had been made. The motel had been in the original search grid, yet no one had thoroughly checked it. That failure now burned in the public's mind. The community's reaction was explosive. Some people were furious, saying the sheriff's department had failed the deputy, failed the prisoner, and failed their families. Others wanted answers about the gang connections. Who had killed them? Why had the motel been chosen as the hiding place? And most of all, how could it have taken 7 years for anyone to figure this out? Behind the scenes, investigators reopened every lead. They re-interviewed old witnesses, knocked on doors that hadn't been touched in years, and checked records of the gang members who had been active at the time. Forensic experts re-examined every piece of evidence with modern technology. DNA swabs, chemical analysis, digital databases, tools that hadn't been as advanced back in 2001, now offered new possibilities. The case that once felt impossible was now on fire again. Detectives worked late nights, fueled by both duty and guilt. For the families, the renewed energy was bittersweet. They were grateful the truth was finally being pursued, but angry it had taken so long. In diners, gas stations, and church parking lots, the story was all anyone talked about. People who had once stopped mentioning the case now brought it up daily. Everyone had a theory, everyone wanted justice. For the sheriff's office, the pressure was unbearable. This wasn't just about solving a murder anymore. It was about proving they could fix what had been broken, even after 7 long years of silence. The case was officially reopened, and with it came a storm no one could avoid. As the shock of the motel discovery spread, one question kept rising above the rest. How was it missed in 2001? The sheriff's department tried to explain. Back then, the search area had been massive, miles of highway, woods, and small towns. The motel sat near the edge of the grid. Officers said they had cleared it, but in reality, they had only checked the parking lot and empty rooms. No one had thought to break into walls or look for secret cavities. But the public wasn't satisfied. Families wanted to know why the building wasn't fully searched. Reporters dug up old maps showing the motel circled in red. That image hit the evening news and people were outraged. It wasn't just a missed clue, it was right there, marked from the very beginning. Critics called it negligence. Some said the sheriff's office had been too eager to write off the case as a runaway deputy or an escaped prisoner. By focusing on rumors, they argued, investigators ignored the most obvious places. The deputy's family felt betrayed. In interviews, his wife spoke with tears in her eyes, saying, "They promised us they checked everything, but they didn't. If they had, maybe we would have had answers years ago." Even the prisoner's relatives spoke out, insisting law enforcement had failed both men equally. They argued that no matter what crimes he had committed, he didn't deserve to vanish without a trace, while police overlooked critical evidence. Inside the sheriff's office, morale sank. Younger deputies who hadn't even been on the force in 2001 now faced angry questions at every call. Veterans who had been part of the search carried visible guilt. The department's reputation, once seen as solid, was now under heavy fire. The missed motel became the center of every headline, every town hall meeting, every coffee shop debate. To the public, it wasn't just a mistake. It was proof that the truth had been sitting in plain sight while years slipped away. And for investigators, it meant every step from here on out had to be flawless. The motel discovery lit a fire under law enforcement. Detectives moved quickly, zeroing in on the gang that had been tied to the prisoner's drug case back in 2001. Within weeks, several known members were rounded up. Mugshots of men in orange jumpsuits filled the evening news. But behind the scenes, the arrests weren't as solid as they looked. Detectives had circumstantial evidence, old reports of threats, rumors of payoffs, whispers of violence. But hard proof, that was harder to find. The murders were 7 years old. Physical evidence had decayed. Witnesses had either disappeared, gone silent, or changed their stories. Still, prosecutors pressed forward. Even if they couldn't prove exactly who had killed the deputy and prisoner, they hoped to at least tie gang members to conspiracy, obstruction, or related drug charges. Families sat in courtrooms, listening to testimony that circled around the truth but never landed on it. For the deputy's family, every arrest felt like progress, but every dropped charge felt like another punch to the gut. The prisoner's relatives, too, showed up, demanding justice, not just for him, but for the deputy who had been caught in the crossfire. In the end, a handful of men went to prison, but deep down, everyone knew the real killers might still be out there. Even with arrests, the biggest questions refused to go away. Who actually pulled the trigger? Which hands had swung the sledgehammer, sealed the bodies in plaster, and walked away? Detectives tried to untangle the web, but the timeline was full of holes. Forensic tests showed the deputy and prisoner weren't killed at the same time, but no one could prove why. Had the deputy been forced to watch before being executed? Or had he been killed first, leaving the prisoner to face his own end later? And why the motel wall? Detectives called it strange, even reckless. Hiding two bodies inside a working business seemed risky. Some believed the killers had access to the property, maybe even owned it. Others thought it was just convenience. Either way, the choice left investigators baffled. Court records couldn't fill in the blanks. Witnesses refused to testify. Evidence that might have answered everything had been destroyed by time. For the families, it was agony. They had answers, but not the full story. They knew how it ended, but not every detail of why. In a way, the motel gave closure, but it also left behind a trail of shadows, questions that might never be answered. 7 years after the deputy vanished, his family finally laid him to rest. The funeral drew officers from across the state, patrol cars lined up for miles, red and blue lights flashing in silence. A folded American flag was carried carefully to the front, resting on his casket. Bagpipes played as the honor guard marched. The deputy's children, now much older than when he disappeared, stood in black suits beside their mother. Their faces showed the cost of years spent in uncertainty. Speakers praised his dedication, his service, his loyalty to the badge. But behind every word was the painful truth. He had not been killed in the line of a heroic shootout. He had died quietly, trapped in someone else's crime, hidden away for years as rumors destroyed his name. When the final shots of the 21-gun salute echoed across the cemetery, his wife clutched the folded flag to her chest. It was closure, but it was also a wound that would never fully heal. The family finally had a place to visit, a grave to honor, but nothing could return the years lost in silence and doubt. The deputy was finally home, but the cost had been unbearable. The arrests brought headlines and the funeral brought closure, but for many, it still wasn't enough. Detectives admitted in private that they would probably never know exactly who fired the shots or who sealed the bodies in the motel wall. Time had erased too many details. Witnesses had vanished. Evidence had rotted away. The families thanked investigators for their work, but the frustration was clear. The deputy's brother told a reporter, "We know what happened, but not who did it. That's not real justice." The prisoner's relatives agreed. They argued the system failed both men, one who wore a badge and one who wore shackles. Neither deserved to vanish without accountability. The community shared that frustration. Bars, diners, and church halls all echoed with the same feeling. The case was solved, but justice had only been half served. In the years that followed, the motel was torn down. A new business rose in its place, but the story never left the town. People still whispered about the deputy and the prisoner sealed inside those walls. For law enforcement, the case became a training example, a grim reminder that even the most routine duty could spiral into tragedy. For families, it became a lesson in pain, patience, and unanswered questions. The deputy's children grew up under the shadow of his loss. The prisoner's family, too, carried the weight of knowing he had been silenced forever. The mystery had an ending, but not peace. And the town, caught between truth and rumor, would never fully heal.